So when is book publishing an app, and what kind of new skills do publishers have to learn? I really just wanted to sort of give some examples of some interesting things as a way of prompting debate. I'm not going to go on for very long, but I hope they'll be sort of fresh to you, that I don't think they kind of overlap and repeat some of the things that the speakers have said before. My take on Ewan's position is I do think he's right, and the question in many cases is not, in my opinion, how do we protect the old ways of traditional industries, but in fact how do we encourage more experimentation and innovation so that British companies can be as big and as interesting and as helpful and useful to people as Google and Amazon. You know, why don't we have a British Google or a British Amazon? And I think another, and you know, one might ask, well, isn't that just replacing a homegrown domestic predatory organisation, you know, with a, you know, from an American one? And I think the second question is, to what extent were those new US internet companies, or to what extent can British or European companies not just take, but actually realise that they also need to support and nurture and commission content from the organisations that they make money from? And I think we are actually beginning to see with those big US companies a transition, so that you're from STV, the TV industry. Well, actually what we're seeing is that in many cases UK TV producers are licensing their TV format rights to large US internet companies such as Netflix, for example, to actually get very, very favourable licensing deals, because Netflix are suddenly in audiences' homes, on their Apple TV or on their other, you know, Xbox or PlayStation platform. So in some cases, I don't think it's necessarily a done deal that those large sort of technology platform owners are completely predatory. And I think, you know, what we'll start to see emerge is you know, this question about whether there needs to be some form of intervention, political or otherwise, or whether these companies will begin to realise that their best bet is in partnership with creative organisations, not just kind of extracting large economic rents from them. But what I disagree with you, and fundamentally, is that you sort of can't put the genie back in the bottle as far as the audience goes. And what I wanted to sort of just kind of state was that good creatives, whether they're writers or composers or filmmakers, or good ones seek out audiences. You know, they go to where audiences go. And what I think is not controversial anymore in 2012 is that audiences are using these new forms of consumption, these new platforms, to get their stuff. They find it easier, they find it cheaper, they find it more convenient. This is the way that they search for their content, and content is a terrible word, but it's the way that one can best probably describe a sort of entertainment experience, which isn't in any one industry, you know. So this is where audiences are. I was reading a book by Jonathan Bale about Shakespeare, and it's quite interesting. In 1593, the plague in London meant that theatres had to be shut. And what did Shakespeare do? Well, the guy, Shakespeare, who had been an actor, who turned into a playwright, when they shut the theatres because of plague, he then turned into a poet and went and wrote Venus and Adonis and had that published as a pamphlet, you know, and he reached new audiences and made some money that way. It's quite interesting because he didn't make there's not an awful lot of money in publishing in those days, but what that helped to do was cement his reputation as a writer with patrons, because he dedicated Venus and Adonis, I think, to the Earl of Somerset. And lo and behold, when the theatres opened, suddenly they were being patronised by people of the nobility, and eventually, of course, Shakespeare's company became the King's Men. You know, so what we see even from 400 years ago is this entrepreneurial nature of writers and creatives trying to reach audiences and where they are. And I think, you know, and not just in one particular discipline, but to use that as a marketing and promotional tool for the other things that they do. It's quite interesting because I was earwigging the conversation along the panel today, and Ewan said, oh yeah, you know, I wrote a couple of articles for The Guardian, and you know, Guardian Online, suddenly I'm getting emails from around the world in different languages, and hopefully that will sell more of my book. You didn't plug your book either. Do you want to give a quick Tales from the Mole? Yeah, so you know, I think what we should consider is while the nature of who takes the value from the industry is very controversial, I think what we should focus on as well is where are audiences now, where are they going, how are they consuming content, and how can you extract value from that. And I think there are some sort of opportunities. So really my talk is more wider than publishing, but I think I want it to be more wider than publishing, because I think it's in those areas of convergence and hybridization that in fact new opportunities exist. And if I was sort of classifying these new opportunities, I'd say that there are new ways for writers to publish and get published. There are new ways for organisations to publish, perhaps organisations that hadn't thought of themselves as publishers before. Traditional publishers, there are new ways for them to extend the notion of what publishing means to new audiences. And of course, there's new ways of consuming content. So that's all I want. I just want to give you some ideas and some examples of those. The first is, it was announced, I think last week, that the Director General of the BBC, Mark Thompson, who's leaving the BBC next month, is to be new Chief Exec of the New York Times. So what we're seeing here is a guy who has been successful in broadcasting, being hired by a print media organisation, very successful print media organisation. And really, that has happened not just because he's sort of editorially sound and solid in terms of news coverage from the BBC, but also because I think the New York Times recognises that its future is not just as a print media organisation, but it is as an audio-visual organisation. And Mark's had some fantastic experience running such an organisation, but also embracing digital consumption with BBC Online and the iPlayer. Traditional publishing organisations branching out. Also last week it was announced that Pearson is to launch a degree course. It's a college, a business studies college. It will teach and offer degrees to business studies students. Well, there are various reasons why that makes complete sense for Pearson. One, it will help give Pearson additional credibility, as if they needed it, in the sort of educational book market. It will attract more academics to Pearson as opposed to other university publishers. But also it will help Pearson eventually get into the area of university and degree accreditation. So it's an example really of a traditional publisher branching out into real-world experiences. It might even be argued that this is analogous to the music industry sort of having to offer live experiences in order to find monies and new routes to market that way. You know, that's a bit of a stretch, but you know, it's an example of a traditional publisher doing new activities to help promote and capture value from its audiences. We've kicked off a program around very local media, hyper-local media, because we think this is a huge area of opportunity. It's absolutely true that organisations such as Johnston Press are having huge issues with monetising traditional print media. That's simply because the audiences are going online or have gone online as a place to access their news. on this programme, we're in partnership with STV, and STV is doing some fantastic things in Scotland around 120 very local news websites. More now than 50% of those sites are accessed via mobile devices. You know, so we get these very local organisations going to where audiences are consuming content and how they're consuming content. Publishing is going mobile. Increasingly, it will go location-based. So your ability to search and filter content is going to be based on proximity, your physical, geographical proximity to it, as well as your area of interest, we believe. And so, you know, publishing is amending and changing and evolving in this way. It's absolutely true that the fantastic margins enjoyed by local media over the last 50 years have been terrifically eroded. Some local media organisations would disagree with that statement, but I think it's true. But they can still make a profit. We're still talking about profit margins of between 10 and 15%. So it's not like it's going to be completely devastated by the changes, the move online. It just means that there will be an evolution of activity. And then in terms of new ways of consuming, this is a project that Nesta funded. It's called Sutton Bookshare. This might horrify some of you, and certainly you, and you no longer need to sell a book to every single person. In fact, why don't you use this idea of using online for collaborative consumption and lend your neighbours books? And there are online platforms, this is one of them, to facilitate that. Of course, what we haven't really spoken about today at all, and that's because I think there's very little evidence, is to what extent do e-books or new forms of collaborative consumption, sharing your books to people, actually result in people buying a copy for themselves? You know, 150 years ago, we might have had a nascent publishing industry in the UK throw their arms up, sort of complaining about the fact that there would be public libraries where people could get books for free. But I think now it's sort of acknowledged that public libraries are a very good thing because they encourage people to read books, and in many cases they actually drive up the sale of books to private individuals themselves. You read a book, you want to read it again, you can't always get it at the library, so you go out and you go buy a hard copy because you want it in your library. And there's very little data available about what ebooks or other forms of electronic or online platforms, to what extent they drive the purchase of books. I don't know whether any of the panellists have got any views on that or any figures, but it'd be interesting to hear them. And then you've got completely new publishing platforms, some of which share advertising revenue, some of which share subscription. This platform, which again is a US internet company, technology company called Pulse. It aggregates content from around the place, predominantly magazine publishers, but also sort of semi-professional bloggers and in some cases photographers, because it looks very nice and they promote imagery as well as the written word. These are new platforms that are finding new ways to aggregate and deliver audiences the content that they are looking for in an easy to access way. In the 70s, the advertising industry discovered something very useful, I think, and it was Coca-Cola that sort of pioneered this approach. The idea was, if you put the ability to buy a Coke at arm's reach from everyone in the world, you will sell more Cokes, just because of the convenience and the ability and the accessibility of doing it. And I think there is a big question about whether that's true for digital content. What we're clearly seeing through services like iTunes and LoveFilm and iPlayer is that if you make these things available, more people are going to consume it. You have an increase in the market, not just a cannibalization of existing sales and practices. And so therefore, I think to what extent this sort of increase in the total market for consuming content can help eventually to subsidise the content production and the content commissioning, I think, is a very interesting question. But there are some new platforms that are growing up, and in the case of Pulse, sharing advertising revenue back with content providers. And then I think, you know, organisations who hadn't thought of being content publishers before are starting to get into publishing in new ways. This is a website called storycloud.co.uk. It was launched by the Story Centre in Stratford, which is an arts charity dedicated to encouraging kids to read stories. And it has a sort of physical centre, and people can go there with their mums and dads and read stories and get into the practice of storytelling. This, in effect, has been funded by the lottery and the Olympics, and it's encouraging traditional authors to write stories. People go onto the website or download it via their iPad. It's web-based, so it's not an app, and it also encourages young people to put up their own stories as well, kids to publish their own stories. So it's a sort of demonstration of new organisations who are tentatively getting into publishing. The funding model there is fully paid for by the Arts Council and the lottery, with a little bit of sponsorship from Westfield Shopping Centre because that's where they're located. But it's quite an interesting model of new ways of commissioning traditional writers and authors. This is an example called Bush Green. There's a theatre in London called the Bush Theatre. It's very special because it only puts on plays from new authors, and bushgreen.org is an online platform that allows any playwrights to submit e-copies of their plays, and it has a community of professionals and semi-professionals and curators who decide what plays should then subsequently sort of rise to the top and be put on by the theatre. So again, it's a sort of new outlet for new playwrights to submit their work and to get it recognised by others. It's not quite as sort of blatant as to be voted on. There is a curation process going on there, but basically it's a new way for writers to eventually end up on stage. And Circle It is another example of sort of a platform, one of the platforms that Layla sort of gave earlier. It's a way for writers to submit their books online, and again, there's a review process. There's a sort of community review process that allows people to rate the work, and there's a sort of pathway into being published. Circle It has some terms of trade with the traditional 6 publishers, so it's a pathway, and in effect it's an online community platform that takes some of the R&D or some of the A&R out of the hands of traditional publishers and lets the community kind of help with that process at a much more cost-effective way. Then of course there's Kickstarter. Kickstarter has its own bookstore, so it's a place where you can get funding to help develop your book, help get it published by the crowd. It's another route for writers and would-be authors or traditional authors to get funding. Kickstarter traditionally is more successful for authors who have had a track record. Okay, so that's really important, much easier for authors who suddenly want to go their own route and bypass publishers, because it really helps if you have a pre-existing sort of fan base for your work. So those really are some examples. I think that we're probably not going to solve Ewan's key question, which is how do we change US internet companies into UK or European companies? But I do agree that absolutely the fundamental issue for content industries is where are their commissions going to come from in the future. What we are seeing is that our traditional content gatekeepers, they probably are spending less money commissioning content en masse. But very interesting to look and chase the opportunities for new commissioners who are arising because of their ability to reach audiences. So that's all I wanted to say.